Chapter 11. He listened quietly as they described the terrifying adventure they had just been on, and when they spoke of the ship, he found himself mystified. There was simply too much that he didn't know, and he felt like new information was coming at him like a freight train. From traveling merchants who visited the various rulers, to strange, mysterious objects and terrifying floods, Garrett found himself almost overwhelmed. When Pax mentioned that they didn't really fancy going back to the southern part of the city, Garrett couldn't blame her. After thinking for a moment, he nodded. "I think that's fine," he said. "In that case, focus your efforts in the east, clearing everything to the city wall. We're going to be expanding in that direction." Sharing a knowing glance with Maron, Pax nodded. "Will do, boss." Pondering everything he had heard, Garrett left the inn and returned to the Dreamer's throne. There were only a few hours before dawn, and he had a few things he wanted to do. The first was relatively simple. He took out the map and the Primordial's dagger that he had purchased from Karn and examined them. Both looked perfectly fine, but when Garrett gathered the power of the throne and used it to shroud the map, a faint black mark soon revealed itself. The mark seemed to be struggling against the throne, and when Garrett saw that, his eyes narrowed and he redoubled his efforts. The mark was simple, but to Garrett, it looked exactly like the dark markings that Karn wore on his cheeks, chin, and forehead, creating an identifying pattern. He had no idea if it was actually connected to the mysterious merchant, but Garrett wasn't about to take any chances. How the map was made, he had no idea, though he was sure that if he could procure enough items with enough value, Karn would undoubtedly tell him. The merchant was mercenary beyond belief, seemingly willing to sell or buy anything. Some of the suggestions he had given Garrett when he had asked for the price of the primordial dagger had bordered on horrific, and it had taken considerable restraint for Garrett to keep from throwing him out. Karn clearly had no regard for life of any kind. He had asked first for human souls, a request Garrett refused roundly. It had taken a considerable amount of time before they found something Garrett was willing to offer and Karn found valuable enough to trade. It had necessitated Garrett calling Delrissa to bring him a full liter of her blood, and Garrett had felt rather bad about it when he saw her gunned appearance. But after she had cheerfully told him that it would be easy to replenish with a visit to the prison, all of his feelings of sympathy had vanished, and he dismissed her with a wave. He hadn't been aware that the blood of a greater vampire like Delrissa was so valuable. As he watched the dark image on the map burn away, Garrett considered Karn further. The truth was, he was suspicious about this mysterious figure who had shown up out of nowhere. At the same time, he recognized that Karn had the potential to be quite useful. The trick was going to be making sure that he wasn't the one who ended up being used. It was no surprise to him that the map had some sort of trick attached to it. After all, it's exactly what he would have done had he been in Karn's position. Once the black symbol was gone, Garrett examined the map once more, paying careful attention to the areas that weren't part of his territory. To the northwest, sprawling over the rest of the district, was an area tinged with a brownish-orange. When Garrett concentrated on it, the image of a spiked bull appeared, reminding him of the Chosen of Gath he had seen stalking the streets. The territory to the northwest belonged to the Burning Pane of Gath, and from what Garrett could tell, the great ruler was headquartered in an old ore refinery. That made sense given the spike-covered bull's metallic nature, but also boded ill for Garrett, who would quickly find himself in conflict with the Burning Pane of Gath if he continued to expand his influence. Unsure what to do, Garrett turned his attention to the south. Directly to the south of the inn, across the river, were the slums, a large section of the city walled off from the nobles who were directly west, near the palace. From what Garrett understood, the slums had originally been an area built outside of the city wall. An enterprising king, many hundreds of years ago, desiring to expand the footprint of the city, had built a second wall surrounding the slums, which at that point were simply neighborhoods, and begun construction. The king's untimely death left the project unfinished, however, and the king's son made it part of the city the dumping ground for anyone deemed undesirable. What had once been a meticulously planned set of neighborhoods designed to extend the noble district turned into a rat's warren of crumbling buildings built over top of one another. With narrow streets and hidden passages, the slums were jam-packed with people, and though Garrett had never been there himself, from what he understood, it was close to another world, and felt nothing like the rest of the city. What was curious to him, however, was that on the map, it didn't appear to be a city at all. Instead, the map showed a wasteland, full of twisted rocks and tall dunes. Furthermore, it was filled with insects of all kinds, and as he concentrated on it, faint lines appeared, indicating tunnels that ran deep under the city. The longer he stared, the more complex the tunnel systems grew, and Garrett quickly realized that he was looking at tunnels that went as deep as the first tomb, if not deeper. The entirety of the slums was under the control of a single great ruler, titled Swarm of Mechs, causing Garrett to assume that the great ruler's powers would have something to do with the insects scattered across the district. Just above the slums, across a thick wall, stood the noble district, though on the map, this area was divided in two. Half of it, directly above the slums, was comprised of hundreds of mushrooms, of all shapes and sizes, growing in and around the houses. Slightly further north, where the main gate led into the city, the houses and mushrooms gave way to a forest of swords, some small, some giant, stuck blade down into the earth. Curiously, there were no great rulers who controlled the area of the map with the sword forest. The same wasn't true for the rest of the noble district, however, and as Garrett selected the territory, he saw that it belonged to the rotting tongue of Wen, a name which conjured a disgusting picture in Garrett's mind. Deciding he would be more than happy to never have to encounter that great ruler, Garrett turned his attention to the final area of the city, the palace, which floated in the air, held down by thick chains. It was as if the palace had been carved out from the earth, transformed into a floating island, and the chains were the only things keeping it from simply flying away. The entirety of the palace was tinged in a faint red, but to Garrett's surprise, there was no great ruler listed as owning that territory. He had fully expected to find the Crimson Eye of Shamorth in charge of the palace, but no matter how he scrutinized the map, he couldn't find the mysterious great ruler anywhere. Along with Garrett, there were only 4 rulers that ruled Insomnium in the dream world, and given what he had experienced in his fight with Agmayoth, Garrett knew that their power had already extended into the waking world. It was a terrifying thought that chilled his heart, but then the warm energy of the Dreamer's throne filled him, and his breath eased. Even if the other great ruler's powers extended to the waking world, what then? Garrett's did as well. He had defended himself against Agmayoth already, and not just defended himself, but conquered his opponent, gathering his power to himself. Putting the map aside for a moment, Garrett turned his attention to the Primordial's dagger. The dagger was 18 inches long, from hilt to its razor-sharp tip, and bore no sign of tools. Its surface was perfectly smooth, with no guard, and a slight curve to the blade. The handle appeared to have been naturally formed, and it fit perfectly in Garrett's hand, though he wondered if everyone who picked it up would feel that way. There was a hole in the bottom of the handle where a cord or streamer could be passed through, and the entire dagger shone with a white glow. As soon as he had seen it, Garrett had found it curious, and when he had attempted to probe it with his mental energy, he had discovered that it was entirely impervious. In fact, the blade appeared able to cut through mental energy with no resistance at all. Such a weapon was incredibly dangerous, and Garrett had been willing to buy it, if only to avoid the potential of his enemies having it. He had no idea who or what the Primordial was, but clearly, the dagger was a powerful tool. Furthermore, even as old as it was, the blade remained razor-sharp, so sharp that Garrett knew if he touched it, it would cut him. There wasn't much else to discover about it, especially since mental energy couldn't penetrate the bone the dagger was made from, making it impossible for him to bind it to himself, even when he tried to use the Dreamer's throne. It was almost as if the dagger existed in a different space, or with a different set of rules, completely ignoring any of the mental energy it encountered. Garrett wasn't one to fight with physical weapons, so after considering it for a while, he put it aside to join the map. There was one final thing Garrett needed to do, but before he got started, he took a moment to stabilize himself, closing his eyes as he began to examine his soul spark. Every day, the throne and the figure on it seemed to grow more defined, details emerging as it grew closer and closer to Garrett's likeness. He knew that when he had finally made it perfect, he would ascend to the manifestation stage, and Garrett was quite looking forward to it. Still, it took a tremendous amount of work to polish and improve his soul spark, and he could feel in his heart that if he hadn't had the support of the Dreamer's throne continually giving him energy, it would have taken him uncountable years to make it as far as he had. This explained why manifesting stage awakened were so rare. At the same time, the closer he got to manifesting himself, the clearer Garrett understood that such powers existed around him, hidden from view. He also opened up his status sheet, checking his experience. Status. Name, Garrett Klein. Path, Dream Ruler. Subpath, Dream Gardener, Path of the Watcher. Level, 6. Exp, 417 640ths. Ever since the sudden glut of experience he had received during the battle with Agmayoth, Garrett felt as if his experience gain had slowed to a crawl. He knew this was just his perception, and not actually accurate. He had been making steady progress over the last week. Balancing the growth of the family and the network of dream flowers with his own personal strength was tricky. He felt like he had found a good rhythm, steadily creeping forward, even as the roots of the dream flower network spread outward. By this point, his heart and mind had become completely calm. Closing his eyes, his fingers brushed lightly over the throne's armrests. He could feel the throne underneath him as he slowly guided the energy it produced into his body, carefully searching every nook and cranny for what he feared he might find. In his cursory searches previously, he hadn't discovered anything, but the worrying tendency to become emotional caused him to think that something was wrong. For over an hour, he carefully examined himself, but didn't find anything abnormal. Still, he didn't get frustrated, and instead began the process again, paying careful attention to his soul spark. It wasn't until the third time he swept his body for changes that he noticed it. The faintest discoloration on part of his soul spark. As he concentrated on the slight shift in color, he immediately realized what it was. After defeating Agmayoth, a portion of his opponent's power had been forcefully sucked into his body, and he had absorbed it into his soul spark, rapidly increasing his progress towards the manifesting stage. Though that power had been relatively pure, it didn't mesh perfectly with his own power, which had originated from the Dreamer's throne. Once he noticed it, however, it was obvious, and he began to see more and more spots of faint discoloration all over his soul spark. A deep sense of fear spiked through him, and as it did, Garrett saw those spots turn darker for a moment, before fading once more. Under him, the throne trembled, as if affronted that such impure energy had taken its shape, and abruptly unleashed a wave of power that nearly knocked Garrett from his seat. He gripped the armrest tightly, a low groan slipping from his lips, as the power the throne exuded began to attack his soul spark. Faintly, as if echoing through panes of glass, Garrett heard a terrible scream, and the fear he felt spiked again. The throne's power poured into him, burning the dark spots, much like it had with the symbol hidden in the map. It was an intense experience, and though not quite painful, Garrett would have been fine for it to end at any time. Yet it continued, as the power of the throne chewed through his soul spark, inch by inch. What was left in its wake was gleaming in gold, a level brighter than it had even been before. When it was finally done, and the power faded, so too did that faint scream. Garrett took a deep breath, his eyes flashing with a clarity he hadn't felt in days. If his suspicions were correct, he had nearly been caught in a plot, staged by Agmayoth. The great ruler had clearly known what would happen if he lost, and if Garrett was guessing correctly, had hidden his soul, or at least a piece of it, in the power that was torn from him as he died. That power, which Garrett had absorbed, had carried a corrupting force, slowly transforming Garrett from the inside. Had Garrett not discovered it, and brought it to light, it's likely that he would have transformed into a completely different person, or maybe even become Agmayoth himself. There was no way to know precisely what would have occurred, but Garrett was sure that it wouldn't have been good. Chapter 12. Slightly worried about what he would find, he examined his soul spark again, and saw a rather depressing sight. The powerful energy from the throne had purified his soul spark, and the energy that it produced had benefited, growing denser and purer, the sense of weight it carried increasing, to more closely match that of the throne itself. Yet much of the definition that he had been so happy about had been erased, as if someone had applied a flame to the figure on the throne, causing his features to grow blurry. Knowing that he would have to redo all of that work, Garrett could only sigh. Still, this was better than the alternative of transforming into his dead enemy. Closing his eyes, he reached into his connection to Delrissa, who had only just made it back down to the first tomb. When she felt the connection through the dream flower she carried, the vampire stopped in place. "Yes, Master, I am here. I need you to bring the artifacts up from the first tomb," Garrett said. "Not the Cauldron of Souls, because that won't move, but the other artifacts. Bring them all to the inn, and don't let anybody see you." Hesitating for a long moment, as she had just run all the way up to the inn, and then back, Delrissa let out a long-suffering hiss. "Yes, Master." Ignoring the frustration in her voice, Garrett closed the connection and opened his eyes. He hadn't realized it, but for the last week, it was as if he had been seeing the world through a faint haze. The fact that it had taken him so long to notice was a terrifying thought, and Garrett realized that every plan he had made since defeating Agmaoth had probably been influenced by the corruption his soul suffered. This is probably why great rulers go mad, because they are absorbing not just the power, but also some of the personality of the people they defeat. "I'm going to have to be very careful about this going forward." Rising from the throne, Garrett walked out into the dream, appearing in his office. Beautiful blooms surrounded him on all of the walls, gently waving their friendly greeting as he passed by. Sitting at his desk, Garrett snapped his fingers, and stacks of paper began to appear in front of him. These were all of the plans that he had been constructing. After sorting through them, he had a smaller stack, consisting of those plans he had either made or adjusted in the last week. As he began to read through them, his lips twisted into a deep frown. There was practically nothing usable among the plans, and now that he was thinking clearly, it was obvious that he had been on a road to disaster. While it was true that the Klein family was facing all sorts of problems, what was even more true is that they had just been handed a series of incredible opportunities, each one with the potential to allow the family to grow far beyond what it was now, expanding its reach and influence, and bringing more and more people into the fold. Conjuring a pen from the air, Garrett began to quickly write, taking care not to drag his hand across the still wet ink. As he filled up sheet after sheet with dense words, even as he wrote, his mind spun, examining each of the problems that faced them from different angles. The first and most pressing was the matter of the princess. He realized now that he had already fallen into Baron Galavin's trap. The Baron knew precisely where the princess was. After all, he had arranged for her to come into the city, and could have just as easily arranged to meet with her. The fact that they were waiting for Garrett to set up the meeting meant that they were determined to pull him into their plot. But it wasn't just him, as the real target was undoubtedly his father, who was currently serving as chief advisor to the regent. It was one thing for him to house the princess, as he could claim that he had no interest in putting her back on the throne. It was different, however, if he began to arrange meetings with the nobles in the city. At that point, his hands would be firmly tied to their cause, which the crafty Baron would no doubt leverage into forcing his father to join as well. Garrett wasn't sure if Princess Eloise had knowingly played a part in this plot or not. To him, it almost didn't matter. It was clear that she wasn't actually in control of the situation, as much as she pretended to be. The one actually pulling the strings from behind the scenes was the Baron. Still, the princess's arrival brought with it an opportunity too good to pass up. The second major opportunity that had been presented to him was a conflict with the Ebony Association. He had already taken down the Brass Tigers, and the Ebony Association was next on the chopping block. However, rather than eliminate them, as he had with the Brass Tigers, Garrett had decided he was going to do his best to add their numbers to his ranks. It was clear to him that the influence he had absorbed from Agmaoth had made him more timid and prone to emotional fluctuation than normal. Now that that influence had been erased, Garrett found his mind spinning up new plans for how he could absorb the Ebony Association into his forces. Of particular importance was their expertise in the swamp that lay outside of the city, while the Klein family was starting to develop businesses and sources of income. The greatest source of income in the city was from the monster materials brought in from outside. The swamp was a practical treasure trove of such materials. Even though Garrett controlled many of the roots, that only afforded him a small piece of the pie. Instead, Garrett's ambition was to begin expanding into procuring material directly. As his hand moved across the paper, ink forming into letters as if it had a mind of its own, a clear plan began to materialize. When his hand stopped hovering over the final period, a cold smile flashed across his face. Jero had set herself against the Klein family from the very get-go, and Garrett felt that he had given her more than enough chances to make amends. Instead, she had chosen to try to eliminate him, ruthlessly sacrificing one of her own in order to make sure it got done. What she didn't know, however, was that she had played directly into Garrett's strengths, while at the same time providing more than enough justification for what was to come. When morning dawned, Garrett found the princess waiting for him outside of his office. Her eyes lit up when she saw him, and she quickly came over to push his wheelchair. "Good morning, Your Highness. It's rare to see you up so early. We have a big day today," the princess said, "and I'm hoping you can help me." "Help you with what?" "I think it's time that I meet with Baron Galavin and begin gathering the support of the nobles. I've had the opportunity to look around the city and see the state of it, and now it's time to begin gathering information about the palace." Garrett didn't respond, pretending to be in thought, while in reality he was condensing a dream flower seed. As they sat down to breakfast, Garrett finally nodded. "I think I can do that. I'll send a message to the Baron, asking if he's willing to meet with us this afternoon. In the meantime, I think I might be able to offer you some help." This was the first time Garrett had ever said anything of the sort, causing the princess to smile and lean forward. "Oh, what do you mean?" "As I mentioned yesterday," Garrett said, referencing their time in Kabod's maze, "my powers revolve around communication. While I can't necessarily help you with actively fighting on the front lines, I'm more than able to relay messages on your behalf. However, in order to do that, you have to accept a bit of my power." Morris, who was standing behind the princess, immediately frowned, but the princess didn't seem bothered by it at all. "How do I do that?" she asked. After thanking Francis for the food that he had just brought over, Garrett picked up his fork and used it to gesture to the amulet the princess wore around her neck. "My energy is not nearly powerful enough to get through your shield," he said. "You'll either have to remove it or allow my power through." He spoke matter-of-factly, his voice completely devoid of any sort of emotion, and after he had finished his explanation, he began to eat his eggs, as if he didn't care one bit whether the princess accepted his offer or not. As soon as she heard that she would have to take off her amulet, the princess hesitated. It had saved her life on more than one occasion, and she was savvy enough to know that by removing the amulet, she would be giving her enemies an opportunity, no matter how small, to affect her. Still, the thought of being able to communicate with someone, no matter where she was, appealed greatly. She had seen firsthand how helpful the ability had been when they were trapped in the strange, mysterious artifact. The truth was, she had ways to communicate with others as well, but the mysterious space inside Kabod's maze had completely severed her connection with the outside world. Garrett, on the other hand, had been able to bypass those restrictions with ease, communicating back and forth and staging their rescue. Seeing that Garrett was continuing to eat, she took a deep breath and nodded. "Fine, I'll trust you." Garrett paused, his fork halfway to his mouth, as he slowly raised his eyes to look at the princess. "Your Highness, I'm not interested in your half-hearted trust. If you don't trust me, that's perfectly fine. You have been asking me how I can help. I'm simply informing you. It is my ardent desire to see you reclaim your rightful position, but if you wish to do so, you're going to have to trust the people around you. After all, you don't have the power to retake the throne by yourself. If you're going to trust me, then trust me, and I will see to it that the throne is yours once more." Oddly, the calm and direct way Garrett spoke did more to assuage the princess's fears than if he had passionately declared his loyalty. She could feel the certainty radiating from him, and when she thought about all that she knew about the Klein family's rise over the last few months, she realized that if anybody in this city could help her achieve her goal, it was probably Garrett. Nodding firmly, she reached up and unclasped the amulet from her neck, ignoring Morris' whispered protests. Still holding his fork, with a bit of egg speared on the end, Garrett stretched across the table, extending his finger to touch the princess's hand. A faint spark of power jumped from Garrett's finger to her hand, even as the dream seed entered her body. "You can put the amulet back on," Garrett said, re-spearing the egg which had fallen from the prongs of his fork onto the table. As he put it in his mouth and began to chew, the princess looked at her hand in wonder. The spark that she had felt when Garrett touched her seemed to swell into billowing waves that filled her body with energy, and as she buckled the clasp of the amulet around her neck, she felt as if her soul spark was blooming. It was the oddest feeling, and though it faded quickly, she couldn't shake the sense that something about her had fundamentally changed. Still, she had chosen to trust Garrett, in part because of the results he had demonstrated, and in part because he had once been her older brother's closest companion. She still remembered watching the two boys from afar, and in her mind, Garrett was almost as much family as her royal siblings had been. As he finished his meal, Garrett carefully watched the seed that he had planted. He had fed it a bit of energy, allowing it to bloom rapidly. As the flower sank its roots into the princess's mind, Garrett saw it produce a second, and then a third, bloom. At that point, the energy he had inserted into it began to taper off, and the dream flower began to absorb trace amounts of the princess's energy. Seeing there were no problems with it, Garrett turned his attention away, not wanting to alarm the princess by staring too much. From here, the dream flower would continue to grow, mirroring the princess's level of trust. This was an observation Garrett had made over the last week, proven by a number of dream flowers that had grown to 5 blooms of their own volition. The blooms that Garrett forcefully grew transformed the individuals into another person entirely, making them completely loyal to Garrett. Those who grew to 5 blooms on their own lacked that blind obedience, and instead it was as if they had utmost trust in Garrett. When he began to think about the blooms that way, it made complete sense to him, as those who carried more blooms were more likely to listen to his words and follow his directions, trusting that he had their best interest in mind. The weight of the trust was heavy, and was a large part of the reason that Garrett had committed himself so fiercely to both growing and protecting the Klein family. Sending out a bit of energy, Garrett hesitantly connected with the flower that had bloomed in the princess, wary that the artifact she wore would see the connection as an attack and trigger, potentially even eliminating the dream flower. When nothing happened, he acted with more confidence, sending a message through her dream flower directly into her mind. "Yes, I'm done," the princess said, pushing her plate aside and then freezing as she realized Garrett hadn't actually spoken to her out loud. Her eyes widened and she looked up at him. "That is what it will sound like," Garrett said, "and passing a message back is just as easy. Simply concentrate your thoughts, imagine yourself speaking to me, and say what you would like to say." Still staring at him, Princess Eloise did as he instructed, and a moment later, he heard her voice in his mind, asking him what time he would set the meeting for. Pushing himself back from the table, Garrett smiled lightly. "Unfortunately, when requesting a meeting with a noble, we don't get to set the time, but if there's a time that suits you better, I'm happy to convey that." Chapter 13. Delighted with how easily it had worked, the princess stood up and was about to walk around the table to push Garrett's wheelchair, but Ren beat her to it. "Good morning," Ren said with a wide smile as she took hold of the handles of Garrett's wheelchair. "Are you ready for our meeting this morning?" she asked Garrett, who, without missing a beat, nodded. Of course, dipping his head to Princess Louise, he excused himself, and Ren pushed him cheerfully back into the hall, and then into his office. Her smile faded as soon as they had entered the room and she had shut the door, and letting go of Garrett's wheelchair, she left him to push himself to the desk while she flopped down on one of the chairs. Her gaze was hard, practically pinning Garrett in place as she stared at him. "Not sure what's going on with you?" but I feel like I'm about to get whiplash." Once again, Garrett was faintly astonished at just how perceptive Rin was. He could feel, through their shared connection, the concern she felt for him, and knew that she had picked up on the shifts in his emotions over the last week. It must have been something of a shock to see that he had returned to his old self so abruptly. Before she could continue, Garrett lifted his hand. "I think the discussion we're about to have is very important," he said calmly, "but before that, I need to give Ob an instruction." "Fine," Rin said, crossing her arms over her chest, "but don't think you can get out of this." Smiling faintly, Garrett looked toward the door, and a moment later, Ob opened it up, sticking his head into the office. "You wanted to see me, boss?" "Yes. I need you to send a message to Baron Galavin's estate. Ensure that only the Baron, or Thomas, the Baron's son, reads it." "Sure thing, boss." Entering the room, Ob glanced at Rin curiously, and accepted the sealed note that Garrett was holding out. After he had left, and the door had closed tightly behind him, Garrett turned his attention back to Rin. "Now, let's discuss," he said. "As we open up the conversation, however, I think some context is important." The seriousness of his tone caused Rin to sit up, pushing her hair out of her eyes. Ever since she had awakened, Garrett had been able to sense her rapid growth. It was as if her soul had been firmly suppressed before, and now was beginning to expand into the size that it should have originally been. As he spoke, his eyes couldn't help but flicker to Rin's forearm, where he knew a tattoo of a raven rested. Organizing the thoughts in his head, Garrett began to speak quietly. "As you have no doubt guessed, I'm awakened, and currently in the shaper stage. My powers do not manifest themselves physically, as you can see, but instead exist in the realm of the mind." Rin had long suspected that this was the case, but was surprised to hear Garrett, who never seemed to trust anyone, admitting it. Noticing the shift in her expression, the corner of Garrett's mouth curled up slightly, and he continued. "In addition to things like communication, illusions, and the ability to interface with mysterious artifacts, I also have access to something known as the dream." This piece of information caused Rin's eyes to widen, and she suddenly pointed her finger at Garrett, pieces falling into place in her mind. "You're the man with the mask." "I am," Garrett admitted. "I'm the one who created and maintains Dreamer'S Rest." As one of the earliest dreamers, Rin had long since gained access to Dreamer'S Rest, and often passed her nights there, interacting with the other patrons. "Part of my responsibilities with Dreamer'S Rest include defending it from other beings with powers similar to mine," Garrett said, "and the foe we faced, who summoned the army of undead, was one such. Thankfully, he was defeated, but in the process, I ended up getting contaminated by some of his madness. The shifts in my bearing and emotion over the last week have been a result of this." Rin listened quietly, her thoughts hidden behind an inscrutable expression. She only spoke once. Garrett finally fell silent, and it was to ask a question. "And the flowers?" she asked, "what are those?" "The flowers are a means for me to extend my energy at a distance," Garrett said. "You might think of it as a spy network. It allows me to pass messages and observe, making it much easier to coordinate the members of the family." Rin stared at Garrett silently for a moment before leaning forward, her gaze growing intense. "It's rather terrifying, you know? To find out that somebody's watching." Garrett didn't protest, and instead just returned Rin's stare calmly. Taking a deep breath, the young woman sat back in her chair. "Okay, so why are you telling me all of this? Knowing you, there has to be a reason." "Indeed, there is. Out of everyone I know, you're the one who knows me best," Garrett said, "and the most likely to notice changes in me. What is truly terrifying is the fact that I did not notice the change until it was almost complete. And even when I did, it was only blind luck. I need someone to watch my back, as it's inevitable that I will run into the same situation again. The forces we play with in the dream are insidious, beyond belief. So insidious, that I fear I might never spot them until it's too late. I want you to act as my guardian, identifying when I have begun to change or deviate. Just as you have entrusted yourself to me in the Klein family, I wish to entrust myself to you. By this time, Ren's eyes had grown wide as saucers, and she stared at Garrett in absolute shock. Wow. It must have really been scary for you to ask me something like this. I think this is the first time I've heard you ask anyone for anything. I mean, anything this serious. I don't know what to say. For a few minutes, they sat in silence, each occupied with their own thoughts, until Ren finally nodded. Fine. I'll do as you say. I'll keep an eye on you, and if I think you're starting to get weird, I'll let you know. But in return, I want something as well. Taking a deep breath, Ren fortified her courage and met Garrett's curious gaze squarely. I want you to teach me, she said, how to do all of this. I'm not sure that I can, Garrett replied, his voice even. Your powers are different than mine. No, that's not what I'm talking about, Ren said, her forehead furrowing. I don't need your powers. I need to know how to do this. Seeing her wave her hand in a circle around her head, Garrett blinked. Oh, you mean run the Klein family? Yes. I need to know how to run an organization, how to negotiate and strategize, deal with threats, you know, all of that stuff. I'd be more than happy to teach you all of that, regardless of whether you accept my request, Garrett said, causing Ren to smile widely, all of the frustration vanishing from her expression. Oh, I know. But all I'm saying is that I want you to actually do it. Does it have something to do with Black Raven? Garrett's question made Ren's smile falter, but a moment later, she appeared to come to some sort of decision and nodded. Yes, it has everything to do with Black Raven. You must be a magnet for people who have lost what is rightfully theirs, because just like that princess of yours, there's something of mine that I need to take back. Rolling up her sleeve to show the Black Raven tattoo, Ren grimaced. I wanted to leave it all behind, to pretend it just didn't exist, but ever since I awakened, I realized it wasn't possible. My soul spark is growing, no matter what I do, and it's even forming into a specific shape. Isn't that a good thing? Garrett asked. It would be, if it was complete, Ren replied, still looking down at the tattoo on her fair skin. But I couldn't feel it. There's a piece of me missing. A piece of me far away. And until I'm able to get it, it's going to be harder and harder to grow. Eventually, my progress will stall completely. But the good news is, I know where the piece of my soul is hidden, and the requirement for getting it is simple. Take over Black Raven. Why do you need to do that? Garrett asked, more out of curiosity than anything else. Because I need the leaders of the Five Wings to be present in order to open the Ancestral Vault, Ren said, sounding rather depressed. That sounds as good a reason as any, Garrett said. I'm happy to help you learn whatever you think is going to be helpful. Let's start with teaching you how to run a team. We're coming into a season when we'll have quite a bit of work to do, both in regards to the Ebony Association and Marcus Parrow. So put together a team for yourself. You'll be directly responsible for them and solely in charge of them, and they will follow all of your commands. You can pick from anyone in the family, but they have to be willing to follow you. How does that sound? That sounds great, Ren said, growing excited. And in return, I'll make sure to watch you carefully, just in case some weird dream thing tries to mind control you again. About to correct her choice of words, Garrett stopped and rubbed his forehead. I guess that is what happened. Excited to begin recruiting for her own personal team, Ren ran off, and Garrett was able to get in a few hours of uninterrupted work before Ob returned and informed him that Baron Galavin and his son Thomas were expecting their visit just after lunch. After letting the princess know, Garrett continued his work up until lunchtime, and then, after grabbing a quick bite to eat, he had Ob help him into the carriage, and he and the princess, along with Ob and Morris, headed toward the Baron's estate. To get there, they had to pass over the lower bridge, a first for Garrett since he had come to this world. The bridge was a massive affair, made of stone and steel. The river below seemed deceptively still, but Garrett could sense the swift undercurrents that even now carved a channel in the river as the water rushed from the mountains in the north down into the swamp in the south. Apart from a cursory glance from one of the guards, they were able to pass over the bridge without incident, and immediately, the homes and streets began to look nicer. They were wider and cleaner, and there were fewer people camped out along them. There were almost no stalls, an omnipresent sight in the northern district, and instead, the roads were filled with carriages and well-dressed individuals strolling leisurely this way and that. As nice as the carriage they were riding in looked, Garrett couldn't help but feel it was slightly shabby in comparison to most of the other carriages they saw, and he detected more than a few glances being thrown their way. It took close to 45 minutes before they arrived at the Baron's estate, a modest mansion set in a small park with a few green rolling hills, no doubt artificially made, and a small forest. They had been directed to a building hidden in the trees of the forest overlooking a wide pond, also man-made, and when the carriage pulled up, Thomas appeared on the steps to welcome them. He waved to Garrett as Ob helped him down, and then came down the steps to lend the princess a hand in alighting. He feigned his surprise very well, and kept a light grip on her hand as he bowed deeply to her. "You must be Princess Eloise," he said. "I find myself beyond embarrassed that I didn't recognize you at the arena. I must have sounded like a complete fool." Secretly pleased that she had managed to fool him, the princess smiled prettily and took her hand back. "It's more than okay," she said. "I was traveling incognito." Garrett found it curious, and had it been a few days earlier, he no doubt would have rolled his eyes. Instead, he just observed them calmly, watching as the two played their game. Though he could see exactly what Thomas was trying to do, the princess wasn't experienced enough to recognize it, and she allowed Thomas to escort her into the building. There were a set of stairs blocking Garrett's path, but Ob walked up behind him, took the handles of the wheelchair, and lifted him into the air, carrying him up the stairs and depositing him at the top. Inside, the princess was already being introduced to Baron Galavin, a portly, middle-aged man, with a cheerful, smiling face and red, rosy cheeks. After greeting the princess, he turned his attention to Garrett, who was waiting silently in the doorway. "Mr. Klein, thank you so much for your help in setting up this meeting, and for providing the princess with accommodation up until this point. Your assistance has been invaluable." Flashing a smile at Garrett, Baron Galavin didn't bother giving him time to respond, and instead turned and invited the princess to sit. Though slightly put off by the cursory way that the Baron was treating Garrett, the princess took her seat, Morris standing behind her. As Thomas sat down, he flashed an apologetic smile in Garrett's direction, and then turned his attention back to the princess. The Baron sat down as well, perched on the edge of his chair as if about to spring up, his eyes twinkling brightly as he stared at the princess. Garrett, largely unnoticed, rolled his wheelchair forward, stopping before he intruded into the conversation. "Princess Eloise, I cannot begin to express my deep sorrow for the loss that you have suffered. And I promise you, we will bring the murderers to justice." "Thank you for your kind words, Baron, but I was under the impression that they had already been found and executed for treason," the princess replied, smiling calmly. Unshaken, Baron Galavin flashed a smile, revealing a set of perfect teeth. "That's the official word, princess. But I suspect, as do many others, that the cause of this incident runs far deeper. There is a taint in our city, one that must be excised if you are to assume your rightful place on the throne." Chapter 14 Baron Galavin, let me be absolutely clear about one thing. Though the princess's tone was still pleasant, there was an iciness to her gaze that communicated her feelings very clearly. "I will not tolerate any suggestion or insinuation that my uncle, Duke Arkov, was behind the attacks on my family. I know my uncle well, and of all those who might seek to do the royal family harm, he would be the last." Opening his eyes wide in feigned surprise, Baron Galavin quickly nodded. "Of course, princess, I would never dream of doing such a thing, but I do think it's important to understand that there are significant barriers in your way. For the moment, let us say that we don't know who the enemy is. If that's the case, then I'm afraid returning to claim the throne will prove to be very difficult." The Baron wasn't telling the princess anything she didn't already know, and her expression grew firm as she nodded. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes," she said, her jaw set stubbornly. For a long moment, the Baron just looked at her, before flashing his white smile once more. "You know, before I met you, I wondered if that was really true, but I can see from the look in your eyes that you really are committed. Pardon me for speaking frankly, Your Highness, but if your commitment was anything less, I'm afraid I would have to call this meeting to a close." The Baron paused, taking a deep breath, his eyes rising above the princess's head, as if he was thinking through the complex issues that lay in front of him. Across from him, the princess waited quietly, while Garrett observed the two of them with a sort of detached interest. It was easy for him, as an outside observer, to see the game that the princess and the Baron were playing, but rather than find it tedious, he was genuinely curious as to what the outcome would be. Since cleansing himself from Agmayath's corruption, Garrett had realized that if he wanted to take advantage of the opportunity being presented to him, he would need to back one of the different forces. The easiest, and most obvious, was throwing his lot in with the current regent, Duke Arkov, brother of the now-deceased king. It would have been a simple matter for Garrett to use his connections to alert the Duke, not only to the princess's presence in the city, but to the plot that Baron Galavin and some of the other nobles were beginning to hatch. As far as Garrett could see, there were three sides to this fight, and of them, Duke Arkov was in the strongest position. As the current regent, he had tremendous power over what happened in the city, and could move directly in plain view, while the other two groups had to move in the shadows. The second side was the princess, who wanted to regain her rightful place as ruler. Though her claim was airtight, and she still had loyal supporters who wished nothing more than to see her take the throne, the princess's position was also the weakest. She had the least influence, the least control, and no guarantee that she wasn't going to be betrayed by the people around her. Her personal power was nearly non-existent, and any political sway that she had was only generated by goodwill, a notoriously fickle force. In between the Duke and the princess were the nobles, who chafed under the monarchy. Nobles like Baron Galavin, who wanted nothing more than to break free of the stranglehold that the regent had over them. These were the three main groups involved in the power struggle, though Garrett was positive that there were many more waiting in the shadows, circling like sharks as they waited to see if they would be able to take a bite. The primary reason that he had agreed to this meeting, and had accompanied the princess to visit the Baron, was to get a better sense for both the players and the stage. If he was going to get involved in this tangled mess, he knew he was going to have to make a decision to support one of the three sides. He had already ruled out the Duke, as allying himself with the regent would undoubtedly put him under Duke Arkov's thumb. Garrett would much rather avoid the scrutiny that would come with such a position, and the thought of putting himself under someone else was untenable. That left two factions, both of which were represented before him. Baron Galavin, though the front man for the nobles, was clearly not the person actually pulling the strings, and while Garrett had a few hints of who wielded the actual power in the nobles faction, they were as of yet unfounded. On the other hand, the princess, who was largely alone in this fight, represented herself. She was not only the weakest, but also the most likely to lose out, as she required the help of others if she wanted to assume her position, which would then make her beholden to them. At the same time, Garrett knew full well that no matter which way he ended up going, he was going to have the same problem. Whoever he worked with would do their very best to ensure that by the end of it, he was firmly under their control, after all. And if they couldn't get him under their control, what likely awaited him was death. As tenuous as the situation was, Garrett couldn't help but feel a faint thrill as he listened to the Baron and the princess verbally sparring. Fishing in muddy water was his favorite activity, and the longer he listened to the two of them go back and forth, the firmer his conviction became that this was the perfect pond for it. After almost half an hour of dancing around the topic, the princess seemed to grow weary of the constant word games, and finally broached the subject that they all knew they were there to discuss. Baron Galavin. There was something in the way she said his name that caused the Baron to sit up straight, and the faint smile that flashed across his face carried a gloating edge, as if he had won something. Taking a deep breath, the princess laid her cards out on the table. Though my father was a popular king, and had the loyalty of the nobles of this city, I have to confess that I'm worried that if I step into the public eye, the nobles will find reasons to keep me from my throne. Ever since I was young, I've known that you were one of my father's most loyal retainers, and I hope that I can count on your support once I go back to the palace. This was what the Baron had been waiting for, and he quickly nodded his head, his expression earnest. "Of course you can, Your Highness. It is my duty and honor to support you. The Galavian family will walk by your side the entire way." "Thank you, Baron. That puts my mind at ease, and once I become queen, you will surely be rewarded, according to all of your hard work." Seeing that the Baron's smile had grown hesitant, the princess fell silent, picking up her teacup and taking a sip as she watched the Baron over its rim. Looking as if he didn't know whether he should speak or not, Baron Galavian finally gathered his courage. "Princess, I'm not sure if I should say this. Please speak your mind freely, Baron." Looking gratified to have received permission, the Baron bowed his head slightly. "As I have said, our family is deeply committed to the righteousness of your cause, but I'm afraid that I can't say the same for the other nobles in the city. You face multiple hurdles if you want to be queen, hurdles that will require others if we wish to overcome." Putting her cup down on the table, the princess gestured for him to continue. "You may not know this, but the nobles really fall into a few different camps. The first is those who are still loyal to the throne, still loyal to you. Unfortunately, our numbers have dwindled, as until now we have been under the impression that your entire family had been caught up in that terrible massacre, leaving no survivors. Of course, as soon as you appear, all of those who are still loyal will rush to your side. I'm just afraid there won't be enough of us." "I understand," Princess Eloise said. "What of the other factions?" "There are really two other groups," Baron Galavian said, holding up two fingers. "The first are those who support Duke Arkov to be the next king. They are approximately half of all of the nobles in the city. And then there are those who prefer to wait and see which way the wind will blow before they make any sort of decision. This is the group that we need to convince to support you. Yet even if we do, our numbers will only be equal to the group that supports your uncle." As the Baron finished, silence fell over the room and Princess Eloise's brow furrowed as she wrestled with the problem. She had known this would be a challenge, but hearing it stated so plainly made it seem almost insurmountable. "What if I have the Duke's support?" she asked. "When I get back to the palace, it's not inconceivable that my uncle will support my claim to the throne." Trying and failing to hide his smile, Baron Galavian shrugged. "While there is some potential possibility of that, we can't count on it. Instead, we need to figure out a way to get the rest of the nobles on your side. But never fear, while this might seem like an impossible problem to solve, I might have a way." Taking a deep breath, the Baron sat up a little straighter as he began to lay out his thoughts. In the pro-Arkov faction, there are three individuals that have particular sway. The first is the Duke himself. After all, if you can convince him to back your claim, then your road to becoming queen will be smooth sailing. The second is Earl Tormund, one of the Duke's closest advisors. They served in the military together, and it's not a stretch to say that the Earl owes everything he has to Duke Arkov. If, however, you somehow manage to convince the Earl to support you, then he would know the best way to get the other nobles who are currently backing Arkov to support you as well. At that point, however, you may as well just try to convince the Duke, because Tormund is loyal to a fault. The third individual, and the one I believe we should focus most of our attention on, is the former king's attendant, who now serves as chief steward of the palace for the regent, Victor Klein." Even before he spoke, the princess had already looked over at Geralt, whose expression hadn't changed one bit. He already knew that his father had gotten close to Duke Arkov, and so he wasn't surprised to hear his name from the Baron's mouth. The princess, on the other hand, was quite startled. She knew that Geralt's family had held a strong position in the palace before the massacre, but hadn't realized that they had not only been able to maintain, but actually improved their position afterwards. Seeing that both the princess and the Baron were looking at him, Geralt bowed his head, looking down as if troubled. Silence stretched as the other two waited for him to speak, and finally, with a sigh, Geralt looked up and shrugged. "My father is loyal to the throne, as my family has always been. I don't know his thoughts, however, as I have not been in communication with him for quite some time." Giving Geralt a sharp look, as if he wished for nothing more than to cut open his insides and lay him out on the table, The Baron returned his attention to the princess. "Truth be told, approaching Victor Klein is probably our best option. Not only does he have the Duke's ear, but, as Garrett has said, his father is undoubtedly devoted to the throne. Which means he should be devoted to you, once you have stepped into the palace." The princess, who had come to the conversation hoping to be reassured, found herself anything but. She had known that becoming queen was going to be a tough hill to climb, but the task that now stretched before her seemed impossible. She was just hesitating when she heard a small voice inside her head, immediately recognizing it as Garrett's. Startled, she started to glance in his direction, but then quickly corrected her expression and took a deep breath, returning Baron Galavin's stare. "What is it that I actually need to do?" she asked. "How do I meet with the steward and convince him to come to my side?" "Before we lay out a concrete plan, Your Highness, I'm afraid we have a few other things to discuss," Baron Galavin said, holding up his hands apologetically. "You see, it's all well and good to ask the nobles to submit themselves to you, but the harsh reality of our world is that no one moves without benefit. So before we can determine how to get you to the throne, we need to understand what sorts of benefits we can offer to those who will come and join our cause." The Baron's words were like pinpricks in the princess's heart, and her lip trembled as words of retort rose toward them. Ask him what sorts of benefits he had in mind. Garrett's calm voice brought a measure of stability to her racing heart, helping her calm down as she asked the question. He seemed surprised that she hadn't had an outburst, and quickly began to list some of the things that he was thinking. "The single most valuable thing that you could offer is the opportunity to participate in the ruling of our fair city," he said. As if able to sense the protest that was about to spill out of the princess, the Baron quickly held up his hands. "I do not mean to say that you should give up the authority of the monarchy, but instead offer the knowledge that once you do become queen, you will seriously consider the opinions of the nobles, making their lives easier. After all, it is the noble families who control the city's industry, who interface with the various groups and powers throughout the city. They are the ones whose funds go to forming our army, and yet, despite their integral involvement, most nobles feel as if their opinions hold no sway. If, for instance, and this is only an example, you were to offer nobles the guaranteed opportunity to speak in the council hall, that might go a long way to gaining their support." Chapter 15. The princess didn't respond immediately, her brow furrowing as if she was considering the Baron's words intently. He didn't pressure her either, calmly waiting until she was done mulling over what he had said. In reality, the princess was listening to a voice in her head, and when it finally fell silent, she took a deep breath, peeking at Garrett from the corner of her eyes. He wasn't looking at her or the Baron, and was instead gazing down at his hand in his lap. Recalling what he had instructed her to say, the princess hesitated. She knew, more than anyone, that she wasn't suited for these games of politics, and so, feeling as if she had no other choice, she decided to put her trust in Garrett's words. "What if," she said quietly, "what if, instead, I offered to form a council, a parliament of sorts? As queen, I would hold veto rights, but, under normal circumstances, would make all decisions with the approval of the council." Her suggestion caught Baron Galavin off guard, and for a moment, he stared at her, his eyes wide with shock. Hidden behind that shock, however, was a thread of elation, quickly buried, as his face took on a wondering expression. "That is an incredible offer, princess, and one that every noble, in their right mind, would jump toward. If you were truly willing to do such a thing, I don't see why it would be a problem at all to gather the nobles to your side." When Garrett looked up, he caught the princess peeking at him, though she quickly looked away. The faintest of smiles crossed his face as he continued to listen to the princess and the Baron talk about the idea. Garrett knew better than anyone that to do such a thing was to begin the end of the monarchy. After all, once they got their hands on power, the nobles would not give it up, for any reason. If the monarchy wanted the power back, they would have to pry it from the nobles' cold, dead fingers. Furthermore, once the nobility gained a taste of authority, there was no doubt that they would continue to desperately claw for more. Under his suggestion, the princess would effectively become but a puppet ruler. As much as Garrett truly thought that this was the right path for the princess to pursue, he had also been testing her, checking to see if she was actually going to put her trust in him or not. She had, spitting out his idea word for word, and judging by the firm expression on her face, she had committed herself to seeing it through. Looking down again to hide his smile, Garrett knew he had won. Garrett felt a bit of excitement bubbling in his chest for what was to come. It took Baron Galavin and the princess some time to lay out all of the details. Although the princess was the one speaking, the Baron had no idea that he was actually talking to Garrett through her. As their conversation came to a close, Baron Galavin turned to Garrett. A smile wasn't quite present on his face. "I think we've come up with a good plan, but in order for this to work, we will still need support from others, including from the steward. I wonder if you might be able to assist with that, Garrett." Meeting the Baron's gaze, Garrett nodded. "I can certainly try. To be frank, my relationship with my father is strained. In fact, I'm not even sure he knows I'm alive. My experience left me scarred in more ways than one." As he spoke, Garrett lifted his arm to show his missing wrist and hand. "This was one of the main reasons that I didn't immediately return to the palace. If it will help the princess, I'm willing to commit myself to doing whatever is needed." "That's a good attitude to have," Baron Galavin said. "Why don't you start by arranging a meeting with your father, under the guise of letting him know you're alive? After that, we can probe to see his thoughts on this matter. Though I imagine once he hears our proposal, he'll be completely on board." Without waiting to see if Garrett would agree or not, the Baron turned his attention back to the princess and stood. "Princess, thank you for trusting me enough to come and see me. Soon, you won't have to hide anymore, and you'll be able to ascend to your rightful place as the Queen of Insomnium. I look forward to that day. For now, allow me to get to work." Recognizing that she was being dismissed, the princess stood and bowed slightly to the Baron. After saying her goodbyes, she led the way out to the carriage that was waiting for them. At Garrett's direction, Ob came to help him down the stairs, while Thomas escorted the princess. The ride back to the inn was mostly quiet, as the princess mulled over everything they had talked about. As they were getting close to their destination, she finally looked up at Garrett, who was idly looking out of the window. Will this actually work? Though he knew exactly what she was talking about, Garrett raised his eyebrows as he turned his attention to her. Pardon? Will what work? This plan, she said, not buying his expression for one moment. If you're asking about the Baron's plan, then no, but if you're asking about the plan that you suggested, most certainly. Even though she clearly didn't believe him, the princess found it impossible to argue in the face of his calm certainty, and before she could gather her words, they arrived at the inn and got out. As soon as they did, Garrett knew something wasn't right. His main clue was Rin's face as she stood by the door, waiting for them. After giving the princess a cursory greeting, Rin took over pushing Garrett's wheelchair from Ob and quickly brought him into his office. She hadn't even closed the door before she began to speak. That greedy gossbag, Paro, has kicked all of our workers out of the factories. We're supposed to have access to them for another 3 weeks, but his foreman came and shut down our operation and threw all of the workers out, saying that they needed the factories for an extra large order of their own. As she spoke, she paced back and forth across the room, clearly furious. I knew using his factories was a terrible idea. How long have we been making soap there? Garrett asked. A week. Why? And have we sold any of the soap? No, Rin said. We're still working through our stock. What's left of it, at least. We're going to run out in another day or so. And how long until Caraway is done with the repairs? Garrett's calm voice helped Rin take the edge off of her anger. Rather than continue pacing, she sat down in one of the high-back chairs facing Garrett's desk. A week, maybe a little bit less, if they work multiple shifts. Have my orders been followed strictly? Garrett asked, not looking up from the account book he had opened. What orders? Rin asked. The orders regarding the soap that we've made in Paro's factory? I'd given the order that no one was to take scraps home. I believe so, Rin said, her brow furrowing. Isn't that the wrong thing to be focusing on, though? Sales have been building and we're about to run out of stock. Now, with getting kicked out of the factory, all the effort we spent to set up our production lines is going to go to waste, and we barely have more than a few batches made. It doesn't matter, Garrett said. In fact, this is better. We need to give them an opportunity. Completely lost, Ren just stared at Garrett as he dipped his quill in the ink pot and made a few careful notes. Putting his pen down, he waited for the ink to dry before closing the ledger. Ren, he called. Flinching as Garrett called her name, Ren sat up straight. If you wish for your enemy to fall into a pit, you have to have a pit. What we've been doing for the last month is digging that pit. Now we are providing the opportunity for Pero to fall in. Why would he fall into a pit? Ren asked, still not following. Because he doesn't think it's a pit, Garrett said patiently. He thinks that this is a golden opportunity to bury us, to steal our formula, to create knockoff goods and to undercut our business. He's not the only one who thinks that, Ren said, grumbling. And that's exactly why this is going to work, Garrett replied. Now let's get the carriage ready. We need to go visit the factory and this overseer who threw out our folks. At the same time, please send a message to Caraway informing him that the workers will be returning tomorrow. Though she didn't quite understand what Garrett was doing, Ren took a deep breath and nodded, leaving the office to go and set everything up. Garrett took a few moments to gather his thoughts in silence before slowly making his way out into the great room. Pero had been an annoyance for too long and it was time to close out the particular problem. The factory that Marcus Pero had lent them was on the other side of the northern district. When Garrett and Ren arrived, they found a crowd of workers standing outside of the door. 3 heavily armed thugs stood in front of the doorway, blocking their path. A thin man with a ghost of a mustache and a permanent sneer stood behind the thugs, berating the workers. Tensions were high and Garrett saw more than a few city guard loitering nearby just in case things turned violent. The crowd fell silent as they saw Garrett's carriage pull up, recognizing that their boss had finally come. As Ren helped him down, the crowd parted, creating a path for Garrett and Ren to approach the overseer. Since the workers had all moved back, the overseer stepped out from behind the 3 bruisers and looked down at Garrett. You must be Mr. Pline, he said, his voice nasal, the employer of all of these miscreants. Is there a problem? Garrett asked. I'm being told that you forced them to vacate the factory. Indeed. We require this factory for the production of our own goods, and as their timetable is quite tight, you will have to find another factory somewhere else. There must be some miscommunication, Garrett said. I spoke with Marcus Pero himself, and he assured me that we would have use of the facility for 3 weeks. It's barely been a week, and we've only just gotten our production line set up. Whether or not you had a conversation with Mr. Pero is of no importance to me, the overseer said. I've received my orders, and that is to clear you out of the factory. You're welcome to go and try and find Mr. Pero, but my orders are clear. Frowning slightly, Garrett turned to speak with the foreman who had been running the shift before the workers had gotten kicked out. I'll go and find Mr. Pero and ask him what's going on. For now, why don't all of you head home, and I'll let you know what's going to happen tomorrow. The foreman, an honest-looking man whose brown hair was thinning, clutched his hat in his hand as he bowed toward Garrett. Sir, all of our equipment is still in the factory. They won't let us retrieve it. Is this true? Garrett asked the overseer. Anything in the factory belongs to Mr. Pero, the overseer said, his sneer growing more distinct. That's not true, sir, the foreman replied. We brought the majority of the equipment that's in there now. They didn't have any of it before we came. Preposterous, the overseer interrupted. I will not tolerate this slander. As he spoke, the 3 large men all stepped forward. Their gazes were ugly as they stared at the foreman and the workers around him. Feeling Ren start to tense up, Garrett quickly held up his hand, calling for everyone to calm down. As I said, I'm sure that this is a misunderstanding, he said. His voice, layered with mental energy, seemed to put everyone who heard it into a slight stupor. Let's all take a step back, he continued. Thanks to the influence of his words, the workers slowly began to disperse, heading home, where they would wait for Garrett's news. The overseer just sneered and went back into the factory, taking the 3 thugs with him. As they returned to the carriage, Garrett could tell that Rin was boiling, and it was clear that if he didn't explain what was going on properly, she would likely take matters into her own hands. After directing the carriage to head to Paro's house, Garrett reached over and patted Rin on the knee. "Do you remember the first conversation we had about Paro?" he asked. As she thought back, some of Rin's anger faded, and her brow furrowed as she recalled what they had talked about. "Yes. I remember identifying that he was an incredibly meticulous person." "Exactly. So meticulous that if there's any sign of a trap, he will immediately turn tail. We can't have that. So all of this is necessary. You keep saying trap this and trap that, but I don't understand how giving Paro an entire production line for free is a trap." "Good," Garrett said. "That means he won't either." Rolling her eyes, Rin grumbled to herself, but even though Garrett wasn't sharing all of the details, he was confident enough that Rin was able to calm down. She trusted almost no one in this world, but Garrett had never failed to carry through on his word. So, she figured she had no reason to start distrusting him now. When they arrived at Paro's mansion, Rin got down from the carriage and went to the door. When it finally opened, a stern-faced butler greeted her, and after a few minutes of conversation, the door shut firmly, and she came back to the carriage. Her anger rekindled once more. "He's not home?" Garrett asked, arching an eyebrow. "No, and even if he was, he wouldn't see the likes of us," Rin said, mimicking what Garrett could only assume was the voice of the butler. To her surprise, this caused Garrett to smile widely, though the expression was quickly wiped from his face as he returned to his normal calm. "Checkmate." Tope continued,